Hello, today I'll be talking about Battle Angel Alita by Yukito Kishiro. I'm not sure if I've read enough manga for this to be a particularly impactful statement, but it remains the favorite of any I have read. I've read the original series, the side stories, Ashen Victor, Last Order, and I'm all caught up on Mars Chronicle. I've decided I wanted to try my hand at examining the series in a closer fashion and share my thoughts in this format. In 1990, this series was released in Japan as Ganmu, which is the most proper pronunciation I could find, and apparently a portmanteau of the word gun and the Japanese word mu, meaning dream. Between 1990 and 1995, it was first serialized in Shueisha's Business Jump magazine and published in 9 volumes. Genre-wise, it's a bit of an oddity. With its heavy action, graphic imagery, and grungy cyberpunk aesthetic, its target audience would generally be young men and older teens when it first released, but unlike most stories aimed at that demographic, the protagonist is female. That might be why it has a reputation of being a bit of a niche franchise compared to some others. The story was still successful in Japan, but it also gained a significant international fanbase for the time. It has the distinction of being translated and published in the West at a time when Japanese media was just starting to get more traction here. It was first published in English by Viz Media as a 25-page comic before being republished in the same volume format as the Japanese release. I want to offer some explanation about how this series was translated before I go on. In earlier days of Japanese media translation in the US, it was much more common than it is now to make potentially drastic edits and changes in an attempt to cater to the English-speaking market. In the case of Ganmu, the most obvious change is the title. The English translator evidently didn't think Ganmu, or Gun Dream, would be very marketable, and they also changed the main character's name. In the original Japanese, her name is Gali. For the English release, Gali became Elita, and Ganmu became Battle Angel Alita. Personally, I like the English title, and not just because that's how I originally experienced the series. That's part of it, I won't lie, but the Battle Angel title communicates a mix of ferocity and elegance that the character exhibits in the artwork. The motif of the main character as an angel is recurring, and the title of an early chapter is Battle Angel, so it doesn't come out of nowhere. On the other hand, Gun Dream is a bit confusing in hindsight, having read this series, because there's a much bigger focus on martial arts than gunplay. According to an old interview, that title came from an old storyboard, a sort of prototype story where Gali was a gun-wielding cyborg cop who ultimately got drawn into a dreamlike simulation, which is a concept that would briefly return much later in the series. In the interview, even Kishiro doesn't seem to think that title fits what the series ultimately turned into. This is all down to personal taste, though. I just wanted to say why I felt that way. There were other translation name changes for the English market, often to make them sound less foreign. The character Yugo became Hugo, for example. Of the more notable ones, in the original there's a location called Zalem, which was changed to Tefares. Newer English releases of the original series using a new translation keep the name Elita and the title due to familiarity with existing fans, but revert a lot of the other name changes. That's the translation I first read and what I'll be using for these videos. I actually read the series with this deluxe set, which packages the series in 5 volumes, with an additional volume for side stories. The deluxe volumes are much bigger and the material quality is a lot better. See for yourself. However, internally, these books are actually still dividing the content into the 9-volume format it was originally published in Japan. 2 volumes per deluxe volume, plus an additional story called Ashen Victor in the 5th volume. The series also seems to be sold in the 9-volume format digitally, as far as I have found, though more recent English paperback editions seem to divide the series into 6 volumes. As far as these videos are concerned, though, think in terms of those original 9 volumes. And this is a heavy spoiler-filled video. Please do not watch if you intend to experience this series fresh for yourself. I plan to have a largely spoiler-free review of the whole first volume out later. So without further delay, let's start the first volume of Battle Angel Alita. Volume 1 seems to have different cover art depending on what version you get. The digital version and my deluxe version use this one with Elita staring into my soul, her cyborg body, a junkyard at sunset in the background, and this odd xenomorph facehugger reminiscent gun clinging to her. I'll spoil you by saying the gun does not appear in this volume or anytime soon. This art actually seems to be a cropped version of the art that appears in the front of my deluxe edition, flipped to fit on the page here, with city smokestacks and another flying city in the background. It seems that this was originally a wraparound cover on the Japanese release. Already there are a lot of cool and moody cyberpunk vibes here. Now the first few pages of some chapters are in color with the digital version I'm using, the same as the deluxe edition. So that gives us our first page, Sunset in a Junkyard. Vast piles of junk are moved about, and we see it's mostly robotic or cybernetic parts as a figure approaches, and then we get our Chapter 1 art, or Fight 1 as they are styled, Rusty Angel. I want to pause on this art because it was one of the first images that came up when I first looked into this series, and it drew me in. I found it very provocative, this graceful yet sad face, paired with a downtrodden posture, composed of bits and pieces of machine scrap. There's a melancholy yet figurative and literal metal quality to it. Like I said, the angel imagery is a recurring motif for this character. Small reminder for anyone who hasn't read much, if any, manga before, these panels are arranged for the original Japanese, which is read from right to left. I know it can be a little jarring to read the English text from left to right, but read the panels from right to left. But if you want to read translated manga, that's what you've signed up for. It used to be common practice, I gather, to flip the images before publishing manga in English, so that they could be read from left to right. That's what the old Viz editions of Battle Angel Alita did, but not so with the newer releases. You get used to it. Our story begins with the figure from before, revealed to be a mechanic of some kind, salvaging parts from the scrap, when something catches his attention. And this is where we get our first look at our protagonist, little more than a partial torso and head as she is raised above the scrap and garbage she was buried in, and our scavenger is very happy. We don't know why yet, and at first glance all he's found is a female face and torso he can use for parts, which makes this scene much creepier than probably intended when you think about it that way. But we quickly find that isn't the case, as our scavenger is actually a doctor/mechanic specializing in cyborgs and robots, Daisuke Ito. Ito explains to his head-plated friend Ganzu that she's actually alive and 100% human, despite apparently being 200 to 300 years old going by the design of her parts. Apparently, she's been in a hibernation state due to a series of coincidences, unquote. Ganzu observes that Ito's a bit of a kook. I don't know what he's talking about. Wouldn't you try to resurrect a 300-year-old body you found in a junk pile? To be clear, she's not a robot, despite appearances. She has a perfectly organic human brain inside that head. It's just every other part of her body that's synthetic. Further speculation about her origins has to wait, though, since she's waking up. It quickly becomes apparent that she remembers absolutely nothing about herself, even her name. In a display of good bedside manner, Ito laughs it off and says she'll remember over time, giving her the placeholder name Elita, after his pet cat that died last month. I can understand mourning a beloved pet, but I don't think naming your patient after it is really what the patient needs. She seems happy enough to have a name, though. With the character introductions done with, the next page delivers some exposition about the world as Ito searches for parts so he can build Elita a new body, carrying her with him on his back as he does so. The junkyard and the settlement around it are simply called the Scrapyard, built upon the refuse falling from the floating utopia above, Solemn. They don't have much luck finding good parts for Elita's body though, much to Ito's frustration. Suddenly, we shift to the scrapyard nightlife, which does give us our first look at how common cyborgs are in this world. Maybe it's a red light district if an establishment called Love Zone is anything to go by. There's lots of people drinking, and someone's riding around this big robot or cyborg. Also, do you like girls with slim waists? How about with no waists, just a spinal column? What the hell? This doesn't seem like such a miserable place, to be honest, though those guys down in the corner probably need to cut back on whatever it is they're taking. It's good to have hidden little details in art like this, establishing the setting. Helps to give the world a sense of busyness and depth. We then see this woman in an alley with a very elegant set of cyborg arms, smoking a long cigarette. Someone she doesn't know approaches her and completely obliterates her head. This is your first taste of the sort of gore this series has to offer, and you're meant to be shocked at how out of nowhere this violence comes from, given how otherwise slow these first pages have been. These 2 pages do a good job introducing what a rowdy and dangerous place the scrapyard is, and setting up the next events of the plot. The next page shows us those beautiful arms are Elita's now, and Ito apparently found her a great big mop of hair as well. He claims he bought the arms off a dismantler for cheap. This is raising some red flags about just what kind of weirdo Ito is. He notes that she will need legs next, and as he prepares to go out for the night, he looks into Elita's room as she sleeps and says, "I'll have you more and more beautiful with each extra part." Okay, an entire forest of red flags should be going up now. And on the very next day, Elita has legs, which she shows off to Gonzu, who apparently runs a ramen stand. He brings the mood down a bit by warning her that there's a serial killer in town targeting women. Going home, Elita sees that Ito has hurt his arm, but he makes an excuse and hides it from her, which makes her suspicious. Later at night, Elita sees Ito going out again and puts together the worrying signs that the reader has at this point about where exactly her new body parts are coming from. So she sets out to follow him to find out the truth, hoping the worst isn't true. She finds Ito tracking a woman and assembling a big hammer out of his suitcase. He goes to strike, but Elita jumps down to stop him, blurting out that she knows he's been killing people to get biological arms and legs? Well, that's confusing. Even in this image, her arms look pretty mechanical, and that's definitely what they looked like before. There's a panel earlier where Ito remarks about wanting to get her organic parts too. This seems like a bad translation. I checked the older translation actually, and it basically says the same thing except for that word. Maybe it's trying to get across that the limbs are proportioned like natural arms and legs, as opposed to a big gun attachment or something. There's a reason some people prefer the older translations. Occasionally you see a word choice in the new one that seems like they might have been more literally translated than accurately translated. Anyway, Ito wrenches away from Elita, but realizes his prey is gone. He swings towards Elita instead, but it's actually to deflect an attack. Turns out the woman he was stalking was actually a hideous, murderous mutant. She knocks Ito's hammer down, but Elita tackles her. The mutant leaps into the air to get away, but Elita handsprings after her, does a flip, and drop kicks the mutant's head into the wall so hard it explodes. The head, not the wall, though what's left of her seems to be firmly embedded in the wall since the body just sticks there. Elita is actually rather confused about what just happened and how she did that, but Ito recognizes that the moves she performed were from Panzerkunst, a Martian martial art. Panzer means panther and Kunst means art in German, so this fighting style is called panther art. But my German-speaking cousin tells me the word panzer still has a connotation of the panzer tanks in German, which makes sense given that she's a cyborg. She's also named after a cat, and her being associated with cats is also something of a motif for her going forward. What I'm saying is that there are several levels to this martial arts name. Later, they go to a place called Factory 33 to turn in the mutant's severed head to this giant trash can with a face that is the receptionist, and we learn that this is how law enforcement works in the scrapyard. Rather than a police force, the factory, which works for Zalem, puts bounties on serious criminals. The factory licenses hunter warriors, basically bounty hunters, to hunt them down and turn in their heads for money. That raises some questions though. Is this the same punishment for all crimes? There's no prison or legal system. Do people just get their heads chopped off for illegal parking? More likely, I suspect the factory only cares about serious crimes that get in the way of productivity. Anything else goes. Anyway, Ito moonlights as one of these hunter warriors. It turns out the reason he was going out at night so much was because he was trying to raise money quickly to buy parts for Elita's body. It just so happens the parts of murder victims come cheap, I guess. He thanks Elita for saving his life, and, satisfied in the knowledge that he's not a serial killer, Elita thanks him for reviving her in the first place. Well, actually, he is killing people, but you know what I mean. He isn't carving up women for parts, he's just beheading criminals for money. It turns out her body couldn't take the strain of those moves though, and she's sort of back to square one in that regard. And that concludes Rusty Angel, the very first chapter of Battle Angel Alita, and I think it's pretty good. This chapter is doing a lot of legwork introducing setting and characters while still managing to get a fun, self-contained narrative across, and the former especially is really well executed. The scrapyard is brimming with atmosphere, and we start to understand its relationship with the city above, Zalem, without crowding out the action of the story. There isn't that much action, but what is there is very striking by the sheer brutality of it. We understand from this story that the scrapyard is a brutal place, built in the shadow of a presumed utopia. We know cyborgs and mutants exist in this world. We understand that Ito is someone that will take an amnesiac girl that's been reduced to little more than a head and risk his life to get the parts to build her a body, though there are still those creepy undertones about him that make you question his motivation. And Elita herself? We understand from this story that, while grateful for being taken care of and still getting her bearings in this world, she's sharp enough to recognize when something suspicious is going on with her caretaker. She's brave enough to investigate for herself and put herself at risk to stop a murder. And of course she's badass enough to curb stomp someone trying to hurt a person she cares about. But she doesn't know her own strength and damages herself in the process. This chapter also does a good job of being a first story for this world and characters. There are a lot of books, comics, movies, and shows that just want to rush into a large, complicated storyline told across multiple entries. That can work and give us fantastic epic stories, but it can also result in the first outing not standing up very well on its own. Look at any of the abortive attempts to jumpstart cinematic universes over the past decade with bloated media that tried to set up too much for the future among other issues, instead of focusing on its own story. The narrative here, by contrast, is self-contained. The characters are efficiently fleshed out, and the mysteries it sets up about Elita's origins don't distract from that narrative. If I had to pick a criticism, it would be that it seems to move too fast at parts, but with presumed page count limitations, maybe that couldn't be helped. Elita's progression from disembodied head with total amnesia to Ito's bubbly ward felt rushed to me, and it sort of just breezes past some big questions about where she came from and how she ended up in the scrapyard. Like I said though, those mysteries aren't too distracting, and dwelling on them too much would have made this story less effective. I just would have liked them less shrugged off, and Elita herself scarcely seems curious. I guess I should also comment a bit about the amnesia trope. It's often felt to be an overused plot device these days to make a character's past a mystery even to themselves, and give an excuse to provide exposition that everyone in this world should already know. But on the other hand, there's a reason it's been used so much. It can be a very effective way to set up a mystery and create a journey of self-discovery for the character. Especially here, where the bleed-through of elements from her past is used to raise questions about what sort of person she was and what she's capable of. Tropes become common for a reason, and if it's used well, then nobody minds. With all that being said, there's an interview out there where Yukito Kishiro admits he didn't actually have a detailed backstory for Elita planned out when he wrote this. He also hadn't figured out what the deal with Zalem was yet. Nonetheless, a good mystery setup is a good mystery setup, and I at least was pretty satisfied when they get some payoff much later in the series. I think it's a very strong start, so let's move on to Fight 2, Fighting Instincts. The chapter art this time is Elita, doing some yoga, I guess. It's a nice hair flip. We begin with Elita going to the factory because she's decided that she wants to become a hunter-warrior. Flashbacks show us that Ito is very much against this decision, and we get some expansion on the somewhat controlling aspects of his character from the first chapter. Ito wants Elita to remain beautiful and untouched by the ugliness of the scrapyard's violence, is how he frames it, to which she stands up, shouts, "I'm not your dress-up doll," and storms out. Good for her. The "I hate you" as she slammed the door makes her come across a bit like a petulant teenager, but she won't let Ito impose his view of what she should be on her. So Elita gets jump-scared by a bunch of these creepy trash cans at the factory. They're called deckmen, by the way, and asks to be registered as a hunter-warrior. Apparently, this process requires no tests or proficiency at all. They just let anyone get a license to kill criminals. It does apparently involve getting an ID code inscribed on your brain with a laser, though. My brain? But I can't afford to get any dumber. The deckman says she'll be fine, but this image makes me wonder if she really was lobotomized. But really, she's just surprised that the deckman asked her why she wants to become a hunter. Upon reflection, this taps on a forgotten memory for Elita, who remembers being asked something similar. She says she's doing it for my own sake. An answer that smacks of independence and desire for self-actualization, but also not very informative. I'm still not sure exactly what is driving her right here, except that she might not be completely sure either. But perhaps her newfound martial arts talent is driving her to explore this warrior part of herself. But enough about Elita for now. Next we go to a scrapyard market to see a man playing with his dog. Fun fact, in the original English translation, this dog's name is Duke. I think I prefer Fang. They get interrupted. Hey old man, how much for the dog's brain? Apparently a scrapyard market is a lot like being in a Chinese wet market. At least there aren't any bats. This guy and the hulking mass behind him don't take too kindly to being refused. The shape tears off his cloak to reveal a huge cyborg. He grabs a random guy from the crowd, pops off the top of his head, and slurps up his brains like soup. Well, who doesn't fly into a homicidal cannibalistic rage when you're hungry, I guess? But according to the slim cyborg, his bro isn't hungry. He's just an endorphin addict, and he gets it by eating brains. Apparently by popping skulls like beer bottle caps. Honestly, I'm not sure if I really feel horrified by this, because the art's actually pretty goofy. Now we jump back to Ito, who is dealing with Elita's outburst like a bad breakup, by throwing all the fancy clothes he got her into a river. Though looking at the clothes makes me wonder if that dress-up doll remark was a lot more literal than I initially assumed. Ew. Then he starts laughing, and apparently he's had an epiphany that he was wrong to try and control and restrict Elita. It's all rather abrupt, to be honest. Like the first chapter, sometimes it feels like characters are just abruptly developed, without us getting much chance to see the development. With that being said, I can't complain too much that Ito is becoming less of a creep. He does speculate about Elita's motivations for becoming a hunter-warrior, that her fighter's blood draws her to such a violent profession even without her memories, basically the same idea I mentioned earlier. Ito then ominously says his gig as a hunter-warrior isn't entirely for her sake, as he suits up like a rocket hammer-wielding noir detective. He finds that skinny cyborg from earlier in an alley, apparently killing some stray dogs to keep the big guy supplied with brains. I must say, this is not a recommended read if you're sensitive to images of animal cruelty. But at least the dog killer gets punished when Ito decapitates him, impaling his head on his hammer spike and telling us that he kills for pleasure. It is genuinely hard to get a grasp on Ito's character in these earlier chapters. He's presented initially as a caring figure for Elita, despite the fake-out about him being a serial killer, with a controlling side to his personality. That's all fine and good, but that controlling side is then abruptly jettisoned here, and we're back to him taking pleasure in murder. That murderous aspect of him has always struck me more as an attempt to be edgy than anything really substantive to his character or the plot, because it rarely comes up again. Anyway, the big brain-eating cyborg is off on his own, having a brain snack next to the yawning abyss, as you do. He has the fortune of being Elita's first hunter-warrior target. She gives herself a little pep talk and charges him, and after processing the horror of having a de-brained body tossed at her, delivers a rising kick that tears off his arm, but she isn't prepared for the counter-strike, which shears through her whole body mid-air. And that's our cliffhanger ending for Chapter 2. So the criticism I had for the first chapter about abrupt character development stands here, but only for that bit about Ito. I really like what this chapter does with Elita. She moves beyond being Ito's dependent and asserts independence. But while we got some proof of her badass fighting skills at the end of the last chapter, this one ends by telling us that she's not invulnerable, and there are bigger and badder things in the scrapyard than her. That nicely sets up the challenge she faces in the start of this new story arc. As for the new villain, well, at this point I'm not sure what to say about him. From this chapter alone, he just seems like a cannibalistic brute, portrayed with art that sort of manages to straddle a line between being grotesque and also a little goofy. Overall, I think it still works. There's definitely some subtext there about the strong literally eating the weak down here in the scrapyard, but a closer look at him is going to have to wait as this story arc plays out. I won't make you suffer that cliffhanger any longer though, so let's move on to Fight 3. What has value? The chapter art is a bit iffy on this one for me, to be honest. It's Elita face to the sky, but the way it's drawn makes her look like she has an unnaturally long neck. Maybe her serene expression is meant to make you think she's dead or calm under pressure. We have some nice colored pages from the deluxe edition here, picking up right where the last chapter left off, with what's left of Elita's body tumbling through the air. Elita is far from ready to give up, though. She gives a battle cry, spins herself to stop her fall with her one remaining limb, then uses that arm to launch herself into the air and punches her enemy in the eye so hard she sinks into his massive head to her elbow. I won't beat around it, this is one of the most badass things I've ever seen, especially from a character that's past the point most would call defeat. This is a pretty straightforward example of how you can use a character's actions in a fight to say something about a character. Elita is obviously tough as nails and unflinchingly determined even in the face of crippling injury. We saw a little of that in her debut chapter as well, where she didn't seem to think much of pushing her body beyond its limits. As we transition to the monochrome pages, a whole page and a half is dedicated to our villain flailing around in agony as Elita is still lodged in his eye. Oh look, Ito's here. Elita's arm snaps, leaving her forearm embedded in our villain's eye and her in his remaining hand. We finally got a name for this guy, Makaku. He's also a lot more talkative now. As he tries to pinch her head open, Ito strikes, showing us the full power of his rocket hammer for the first time, and it is impressive. He obliterates half of Makaku's body, freeing Elita in the process. If there's any element of the series I think is underutilized, it would be Ito's rocket hammer, because that thing is incredibly cool. But apparently, Makaku's head is detachable, and a separate entity, with a sort of snake or worm-like body. As Ito looks for Elita, he slithers up and fires his head spike at him. Ito gets impaled. That must be the last of his offensive capabilities though, because despite both Elita and Ito being completely helpless, Makaku just swears vengeance, quotes Nietzsche, and skedaddles, like me when I leave parties. Oh, and apparently his intellect is tied to the body he inhabits, which is why he was a dumb brute up to now, and presumably he'll be a more clever opponent going forward. Ito reveals that Makaku has been on the wanted list for years, but no hunter-warrior has had the nerve to go after him. After yanking the spike out of his chest, Ito carries Elita's unconscious, destroyed body through the streets, leaving a trail of blood from his wound. And here we're struck with another bleak aspect of the scrapyard: indifference. Ito can barely walk, he's covered in blood, Elita's in an even worse state, and nobody helps. Nobody will even look at them. They just stare at the gladiatorial blood sport they watch for entertainment around here, tweak out on drugs or anything else, and ignore the desperate bleeding man right next to them. Ito has to get to a phone booth to call his friend Gonzu for help. Now this is a bit heavy-handed, but I like that Kishiro is just showing this without making it the direct focus of the scene or the story. It's a bit of social commentary that doesn't overstay its welcome. What is in focus here is Ito's newfound resolve. Elita, I'll find you a body worthy of a warrior. A powerful body that can withstand battle. The strength to take a human life with one blow. With each step, growing further from my dream for you. Fight, so that you can survive in this rotten world. There's no single thing in this world that's worth risking your life for. Nothing, except for what you've built up on your own. And for me, that would be you. And we close this chapter with Ito fading fast and clutching Elita to him as he bleeds out in a phone booth. Okay, what to say about this chapter? I think both the action in the first half of this chapter and the atmosphere of the ending shine tremendously here. Elita launching herself into the air with her one hand and stabbing it into Makaku's eye is iconic imagery for this early part of the series. It demonstrates her determination and grit even in the face of defeat, and she does lose. Makaku demonstrates himself to be a very serious threat, and is firmly established as a significant obstacle for Elita to overcome. This chapter also starts establishing parallels between Elita and Makaku. They're both almost complete cyborgs whose brain or head is their last remaining biological core. Both lose their bodies in this fight, requiring them both to get new, more powerful ones before they can fight again. Let's look at that Nietzsche quote Makaku left us with, though, in reference to how his intelligence is tied to the bodies he uses. The spirit is but a plaything of the body. Now, I'm not a philosopher, but I don't think you need a deep philosophical grounding in Nietzsche to understand what's going on here. On the face of it, Makaku is asserting that his body molds who he is and how he interacts with the world, as much as or more than his mind. That can seem like an excuse, but Makaku doesn't seem to be any less vile outside of his body, he was just less intelligent. What about that worm body of his, though? Now take that and look at someone like Elita. Enacting her martial arts broke her body earlier. What her mind and instincts said she could do didn't match what her body was capable of. As a result, her body broke. A body that limits what she can do can be said to restrain her. But what would having a body that could keep up with her violent abilities mean for her mind? This theme is going to be coming up again as we go forward, but I want you to think of it and keep an eye out for related themes throughout this whole series. Kishiro likes exploring ideas of identity and humanity through these cyborg characters. Elita herself is arguably little more than a brain in a jar with a pretty casing. Is just a brain enough to be human? How does the inhuman body shape that mind? Just how much of a person needs to be biologically human for a person to stay human, if any? These are all things worth keeping in the back of your mind as you look at this series. And then there's Ito. His section at the end is essentially nailing down his character progression from the last chapter more poignantly, while demonstrating just how devoted he has become to Elita. The indifference of the crowd to their plight really drives home what a rough place the scrapyard is, and how important it is for Elita to be strong in her own right in order to survive in a world like this. Reflecting on what Elita means to him, Ito lets go of his dream of sheltering her from the evils of the world, and resolves to give her a body suited to battle. But again, how will having such a body affect Elita? We can jump straight forward to find answers to those questions in Fight 4, Resurgence. Well, this chapter art immediately gives away that Elita will get a new body, I guess. Though I can tell you there isn't a gun in this chapter, so that's a weird inclusion. I like this art fine, but I have a hard time connecting it to the actual events of the chapter. We start off with a dream. Elita sees herself as a child. What follows is a surreal replay of the story so far, starting from the scrap pile where Ito picks her up and assures her that she is safe. Cut to the operating room where Gonzu has managed to keep Ito and Elita alive. Discussing Ito's injuries, Gonzu actually brings up an interesting point here that becoming a cyborg often becomes a form of debt slavery in order to pay for the upkeep and replacement parts. That could actually be an interesting premise unto itself, but here I think it's just being provided as an additional reason a smart person probably doesn't seek out becoming a cyborg. Ito thinks now is the time to give Elita her new body, so he takes them all down to his secret basement, filled with old science fiction references. This is a collection of things Ito has scavenged over the years. What they're here for is this scary thing displayed on the wall. Well, listen, do you know Five Nights at Freddy's? Horror game series about a bunch of creepy animatronics haunting a Chuck E. Cheese style restaurant. Well, part of that series is that the animatronics are actually suits a person can get into, but only if the internal workings are held back by a locking mechanism. If the mechanism fails, it all snaps back and crushes the person inside. I only bring that up because that's what this imagery brings to my mind, and it makes me uncomfortable. Luckily, that doesn't linger for too long, since it all snaps together when Ito plugs it in, revealing a full cyborg body. This, of course, raises the question that Gonzu asks, if Ito had this in storage the whole time, why didn't he give it to Elita in the first place? That's because it's a berserker. Apparently, berserkers were a type of cyborg body developed off-world for soldiers. Ito found it in a crashed spaceship in a ravine somewhere outside the scrapyard, remnants from some old war. They would take perfectly healthy soldiers and put their brains in these berserker bodies to make them stronger and more effective killers. That sort of unnecessary, callous mutilation horrified Ito, so he locked it away. He isn't sure if giving Elita such a body is a good idea, but what he does know is that she knows how to wield power, so the only thing he can do is give it to her. And apparently Ito can also program it to have a female figure, so no need to be so broad-shouldered. But he needs Gonzu to perform the operation because of his injuries, and to be fair, he does have some medical experience, as a vet. He complains, but it seems he'll do it, as we go back to Elita's dream. There's a very poignant callback to an earlier scene here, one where Ito had carried Elita's limbless body around while searching for parts, but this time she sees herself as an actual child. She even says that she's satisfied with her life with Ito, and isn't interested in rediscovering her old life. She sheds that childish persona immediately, however, when Ito is in trouble. This whole section is like a replay of Elita's mental development so far with metaphoric imagery, and I have to say I rather like it. As she tears through the mutant serial killer, Elita feels a force within herself she can't understand, pushing her forward. She's intent on going faster until she can understand, and that leads her straight to her disastrous encounter with Makaku. Not a face to look at before you go to sleep. Elita awakens after surgery, and she's quite happy with her new body. Ito and Gonzu soon fall asleep from exhaustion due to the long operation, which gives Elita the chance to contemplate Ito's injury. This enrages her, and she swears to crush Makaku's brain in her fist the next time they meet. I love her ferocity, even if it is a bit bloodthirsty. I'll come back to this at the end of the chapter, but I want to note that her anger here is driven not by what Makaku did to her, but by what he did to Ito. Now our scene shifts to another place, with two big cyborgs going at it. We actually got a little cameo from this character in the last chapter. This is the gladiatorial champion Kinuba, who dices his opponents with his grind cutters, basically extendable chainsaw whips that deploy from his fingers. Later, we see Kinuba taking his rest after the match when a fan intrudes. Kinuba is surprisingly bemused that he managed to get past security and offers him a drink. I can't imagine many celebrities would be cool with this, but if you have chainsaw fingers, I guess it takes a lot to make you feel unsafe. He explains that he owes his success to the grind cutters. Not all is as it seems though, as you may have guessed.
I like your power and body, and now they will belong to Makaku. Gahaha!
You thought it was a creepy fan, but it was I, Makaku, only slightly more creepy. It looks like he's using the limbs of his henchman that Ito beheaded and the head of one of his victims to disguise himself. If nothing else, it emphasizes how grossly oversized Makaku's head is. Then again, Kinuba also looks inhumanly huge. A brief fight ensues where Makaku successfully evades the grind cutters and manages to force himself into Kinuba's body. It's rather horrifying, and we don't see exactly how, but somehow Makaku must have ripped out and replaced Kinuba's head from his own body, brutally taking it for himself. The stage is set for a confrontation between Makaku's new grind cutters and Elita's berserker body. But we don't just jump to that, instead we go to a scene looking up to Zalem, where Elita and Ito are getting introspective. This is also where we get one of Elita's more iconic looks, that black outfit, trench coat, knee pads, fingerless gloves. It's tough looking and sleek, and I like it. They comment on the sound of the tubes connecting the factory to Zalem moving, which happens because the effect of the moon's gravity causes Zalem's elevation to shift. That's a nice little world-building detail, but Elita says it's a horrid sound, like the screaming of a great mass of people. A bit dramatic, but it works as a commentary on the plight of the scrapyard below the utopia of Zalem and shows a contemplative side to Elita. Ito notes it and remarks on her maturity, at which point she turns giddy as a schoolgirl for his praise. He is concerned that the berserker body could be having an effect on her mind, but she assures him that no matter how much she seems to change, she'll always be the same Elita he knows. As they go down to the Kansas bar, and there's a blink and you'll miss it moment where Elita is carrying Ito's wheelchair over her head with one hand, they're both really nonchalant about it. Apparently this bar is a place where hunter warriors are known to hang out. As to why it's called the Kansas bar, well, there are maps later in the series that show this whole city is actually located in Kansas. Anyway, Ito is pretty popular among the hunter warriors because he does their repairs, and is pretty lenient about payment it seems. Remember that guy whose dog Makaku wanted to eat? Well, he's the bar owner, and he has his dog and baby daughter Koyomi with him. Ito tries to get the hunter warriors roused to help beat Makaku, but they ignore him. Apparently a lot of hunter warriors have died going after Makaku. A hunter warrior named Zapan in particular tells him off. So what does Elita do? She calls a lot of them cowardly, sniveling weaklings and starts a fight. Elita pretty easily beats the crap out of them, humiliating Zapan especially, and physically ejects them from the premises. This goes on for several pages. Ito is upset, but the baby's enjoying it at least. Outside, though, the hurt hunter warriors are confronted with something scarier than Elita. In a pause of the fight, it bursts through the door, smashing it because it's too small. Of course, it's Makaku. One of the patrons mistakes him for Kinuba and gets sliced to pieces, and his brain eaten for his trouble, leaving no doubt about his identity. That's where we leave Chapter 4, leading into the Climactic Confrontation. On the face of it, the 4th chapter is essentially covering Elita's recovery from her fight with Makaku, and Makaku acquiring a new body. They're juxtaposed, with Elita getting her new body and strength from someone that loves and cares about her, and her revenge is in retaliation for what was done to them rather than herself. Meanwhile, Makaku steals his new body and power in an act of brutality from someone he envies, and his notion of revenge is purely for himself. This is not the subtlest or most groundbreaking of analyses, I know, but the contrast is very effective at doing what the initial chapters of Battle Angel have been doing all along, illustrating who Elita is by contrast and through how she reacts to a harsh world. The bar scene continues that by showing her willingness to stand up to people who might not be evil, but won't do what's right out of fear. It also raises questions about how her berserker body may be influencing that aggression. Might this ultimately not be a good thing? We'll have to see. Let's get right to it and start the penultimate chapter of Volume 1, Fight 5, Trap at the Mouth of Hell. Chapter 5 starts with a look at the damage Makaku did to the Kansas bar on the way in. The sign outside, hanging by a single wire now, falls and tumbles down the stairs into the confrontation between Makaku and Elita. Makaku notes Elita's new body, and she says that he's using scanners to detect her body. I'm pretty sure he could reason that one out based on her having more limbs than she did last time they met. That leads us into our chapter art, which is easily the weirdest and my least favorite of the bunch so far. I presume this is supposed to be a representation of Makaku scanning Elita. Maybe this was cooler in the 1990s when this originally came out, and this sort of imagery might have been more of a novelty, but it just looks like a pixelated mess of an image to me. It's also the only chapter art that's colored in this volume, which is interesting. I can tell you it looks much worse in grayscale. So Makaku keeps doing his creepy tongue thing as he describes what he wants to do to Elita. Rip off her limbs and turn her into a living pendant he can wear so he can hear her screams of anguish throughout the day. Elita's reaction is completely nonchalant. "Whew, you're kind of messed up, aren't you? You really can't imagine happiness any other way?" She just thinks this is sad, kind of pathetic. And curiously, Makaku seems to agree, referring to himself as a worm. More creepy tongue stuff, and baby Koyomi catches his eye. That makes him introspective, explaining that his life began in fear and pain, and he found the secret to conquering it was to pass that fear and pain on to others. For that, he needed power. Makaku threatens Elita with one of his grind cutters, but she kicks it away and starts dodging his every attack. Even as he increases his speed, she attacks by literally running along his grind cutter. But Elita is quickly knocked aside as Makaku reveals that all 5 of his fingers are grind cutters, not just the one. He goes on about how he could have killed her already, and this is something that makes Ito wonder, is Makaku in love with Elita? I have to say I'm not on board with this turn. This statement is kind of out of nowhere from Ito. I'm not opposed to Makaku having some twisted feelings for Elita, but calling it in love and bringing it up in this way is just kind of silly. Back to the fight. Makaku grabs baby Koyomi and starts making funny faces at her. This genuinely made me laugh. It's absurd. He threatens to eat Koyomi, and when Elita objects, he breaks open a hole in the floor, inviting her to come after him into the sewers and save the baby. I should note that the dog Fang immediately leaps after him to go after the baby. Now that's a good dog. The few surviving patrons of the bar jump for joy that Makaku has left, and they're somehow still alive. But Elita is staring after him with a look of fear on her face. She finds her resolve, though. Even though she knows it's a trap, she tells Ito it's her responsibility after talking up a big game to all those hunter warriors, and there's no way she can leave a baby to such a horrible fate. So Alita promises Koyomi's father, the bar owner, that she'll bring the baby back and takes the plunge. Okay, I actually like this little moment quite a lot. This could have been straightforward, with Elita immediately leaping after Makaku. Instead, we got this moment of fear and Elita acknowledging the situation. She's not fearless, and she knows it's a trap, but Elita goes anyway because she knows what's important and what's at stake. It goes to show how a little moment can make a character seem both smart and principled. So it turns out the scrapyard sewers are a lot more cavernous than you would expect. It makes you wonder just how structurally sound a lot of those buildings up above are. Elita does not have a smooth landing. She bounces off some sort of broken pillar or pipe and stops herself by stabbing it with a single finger. But the whole thing then falls into what I will optimistically call water. It's a surprisingly slapstick start to this confrontation, actually. Up above, Ito is frustrated by what little he can do. The bartender, it occurs to me we still don't know his name, is understandably out of his mind with worry and wants to know if Elita even has a chance. Ito doesn't think Elita's Panzerkunst, her cyborg martial arts, will be enough to beat Makaku's grindcutters, but her berserker body has a battle mode that may save her. Its activation is tied to the basal ganglia, the instinctive part of the brain tied to muscle movement, so only Elita's survival instincts will be able to activate it. Meanwhile, Elita shakes herself off like a dog. Surprisingly, it works. Kishiro has a way of making sure you don't take these life or death situations too seriously. She starts her search through this strange underworld, which involves seeing some things I'd rather not think about in that water. Elita is briefly overcome. She's afraid, but somehow she feels truly alive for the first time. Now that could be her berserker body activating, like Ito just said, but I think the more thematic thing going on here is about facing danger, not fearlessly, but despite fear, and for the right reasons. Speaking of reasons, soon Elita hears Koyomi crying. Realizing it's a trap, soon she's dodging ultrasonic grindcutters as Makaku emerges from the water. And so our villain takes the time to explain that this place is what remains of a great city, and it's where he grew up, subsisting on the runoff corruption from the scrapyard as the scrapyard subsists on the refuse of Zalem. Elita manages to get hold of the baby, which seems to trigger something in Makaku. See, apparently, his mother gave birth to him in a toilet and immediately flushed him away. It's several de-brained bodies and one kidnapped baby too late for me to feel sorry for Makaku, but I will point out the parallel being made here. Elita herself is a cast-off, having been consigned to a trash heap before Ito found her. But Makaku doesn't wax sentimental for more than a second, as he notes Elita can't move around as fast while holding Koyomi, because she apparently has been moving so fast that a baby could be hurt just by moving the speed of her dodging. Because laws of inertia are apparently where this story of a cyborg martial arts girl fighting chainsaw whips engages in realism. But their bacon is saved by Fang. This wonder dog launches at Makaku's face and rips Elita's old arm out of his eye socket, which has been stuck there all this time. Makaku reels and snacks on some brains he's been saving, for the endorphins, I guess. Elita gives Fang the praise he deserves and hands off Koyomi so he can carry her to safety, and she'll be free to fight. Makaku lashes out, but Elita retaliates with 2 fingers and cuts off his arm. She takes a moment to put on some war paint, which just seems to be some sort of tar, I guess, and tells Makaku that she's his opponent, as her arm bursts into flame. How that works is something that will be fully explained in the next chapter. So that's chapter 5. At the beginning, it's sort of a false start to the actual battle between Elita and Makaku, but it establishes that Makaku is still a significant obstacle for her despite her new body. Then she gets a chance to affirm her resolve in the face of fear and saves a baby, so without any bystanders in danger, she can finally go toe-to-toe with Makaku. Alita gets to engage in some old-fashioned heroics here, literally saving a baby and getting help from a friendly dog. This could be a Saturday morning cartoon if the villain wasn't snacking on severed heads. I very much like the upbeat tone of this chapter, building Alita up and starting to reveal that battle mode Ito was talking about. This is also the start of Alita's famous war paint, which she'll wear in different forms throughout the series, though it'll mostly be metal later. Now let's start the final chapter of Volume 1, Fight 6, Battle Angel. Our chapter art this time is a close-up of Alita's face, war paint and all. Fitting really, given the title. This chapter is very much a chance for Alita to show off how powerful she is. In fact, most of it is a single continuous battle. Let's dive right in. We start right where Chapter 5 left off, with Makaku staggering and screaming from the loss of his arm, which apparently was covered in 40mm thick armored skin. That's in a range of the steel plating on modern warship hulls, at least from some cursory research I did, though apparently modern warships actually have thinner plating than ships from World War II. Enough of that tangent. Alita isn't actually sure what she did or how she did it. Luckily, Makaku's new body has some kind of combat analysis AI built into it, which has been silent until now, named Boarhead. He'll be happy to explain. Apparently, the Berserker body is able to fire highly compressed air from its fingertips, combined with an electric current to unleash a small plasma jet superheated to 15,000 degrees Celsius. In short, her fingertips are plasma torches, but she actually uses it as propulsion to accelerate her fists. This sort of propulsion is called magnetohydrodynamics. There's a note at the bottom of the page noting that the concept of using plasma-based propulsion was popularized by the film The Hunt for Red October. That's the one where Sean Connery plays a Russian submarine commander.
Comrades, our own fleet doesn't know our full potential. We will pass through the American patrols, past their sonar nets, and lay off their largest city, and listen to their rock and roll.
Magnetohydrodynamic propulsion. You follow?
No.
It's like a jet engine for the water. Goes in the front, gets squirted out the back, only it's got no moving parts, so it's very, very quiet.
I guess that's where Kishiro got the idea. Makaku doesn't know what to do about this, but Alita is filled with resolve. The fear she felt earlier is gone entirely, her mind entirely focused on defeating the monster in front of her. Boarhead tells Makaku to attack before Alita can close the distance, but his missing arm throws off his ability to absorb the recoil of the grind cutters, and he misses. I also want to note here that Boarhead clocks Alita's speed at just shy of Mach 1. That's over 720 miles per hour, or over 320 meters per second. She's really moving. He tries to grab her as she gets closer, but Alita whips herself around his arm. Makaku tries to smash her against a wall, but she flips up and lands on his head, prompting Boarhead to declare game over. I like the way Kishiro drew her hair here. There's a great sense of movement. Alita doesn't go for the killing blow, though. She offers him a chance to surrender first, or she'll burn out his brain. Makaku still has a trick up his sleeve, though. Having grown up in these sewers, he knows that a tank on the surface dumps its wastewater down on this spot at a specific time each day. It just so happens to be that time. A great deluge of what I will once again optimistically call water hits them both and sweeps them away. A cutaway does show us that Fang and Koyomi are safe, though. The current pushes Alita and Makaku over a precipice, and our heroine is unable to fight it. Worse, being submerged also neutralizes her ability to create plasma. Makaku destroys Boarhead for pronouncing game over earlier, and reiterates his plans for dismembering her and keeping her as a living pendant. How he's saying all this while underwater, I'm not sure. The moment he tries to use his grind cutters, though, his remaining arm explodes, and Alita flashes a little victory sign. Makaku rockets out of the water and crashes onto the bank, with Alita walking out after him. I rather like this look for her with her hair wet. Alita explains that when she swung around his arm earlier, she weakened it with her plasma cutter fingers. So when subjected to the stress of firing the grind cutters, it exploded. This triumphant note is the end of Chapter 6, and this chapter is just some really fun action. It really lives up to the title Battle Angel. Not only is Alita powerful, she's also clever enough to really neutralize Makaku before declaring victory, and without him even noticing. This is really where this series starts to hit its stride in terms of action, I think. This isn't quite the end of this storyline, however, which will continue in Chapter 7. There is, however, a little informational section at the end of this chapter I could go over: the factories and the deckmen. Apparently, the factories are basically government offices managing the industries of the scrapyard that produce food and other products for Zalem. Each one seems to be situated at the base of those transportation tubes leading to Zalem. The factories are staffed entirely by the deckmen, who are cyborg functionaries apparently created from recruits from the scrapyard. Deckmen travel through the factories via a series of tubes that connect them to various functions they plug into. Though they have human brains, they are basically stripped of free will. There's a darkly comedic parody sketch of Alita becoming a hunter-warrior, but it's a deckman recruit. Why does he want to become a deckman? For my own reasons. I should reflect now on the volume as a whole. Volume 1 of Battle Angel Alita is a pretty strong start for the series. The character introductions and world building move fast, but for the most part they still work very well. The scrapyard is vividly established as a dystopian setting, filled with danger and moral decay, subject to the distant, neglectful rule of a floating utopia, Zalem, though it is shoved into the background a bit as Alita's conflict with Makaku ramps up. Alita is a pretty well-developed character and a cool hero. She has some mystery to her, but there's also a sort of coming-of-age story element in her evolving relationship with Ito. She's pretty happy to have someone taking care of her to start with, but she becomes more independent and then clashes with the harsh dangers of the real world. Her response to those dangers is part of why I like her character so much. She is genuinely heroic, still figuring things out, but when someone she cares about is hurt or an innocent is in danger, she throws herself into the ring. She did that in the first chapter when she tried to stop Ito attacking what she thought was an innocent woman. Then later, with Koyomi, she leaps after Makaku despite knowing it's a trap and having just been knocked around by him, overcoming fear. On top of that, she's perceptive and smart, not a genius and not infallible, but capable of understanding the situation she finds herself in and responding appropriately. She doesn't just punch hard, she fights smart, and tells people off when they need it. Again though, she isn't immune from making mistakes, and pays for it when she bites off more than she can chew. Now that's not to say all the characters are handled perfectly. Ito in particular is a bit inconsistent. Overall I like his development by the end of the third chapter, but before that it's a bit confusing with him abruptly developing without much build-up. I don't really want to comment on Makaku too much because there's still one more chapter left in the fight between him and Alita. I will say a little about how the first volume juxtaposes them. Both are cyborgs with completely artificial bodies. Both are very powerful combatants. However, when she's hurt, Alita is built back up by people that care about her, while Makaku does so by murdering someone. Alita swears vengeance on behalf of Ito, while Makaku swears only for himself. We see how Alita is driven by her feelings for others, while Makaku is driven by envy and wounded pride. The result is Makaku serving as an effective foil for Alita that illustrates who she is and what she isn't. I have more to say about that, but I'll save it for a video dedicated to the Makaku arc as a whole. Battle Angel Alita Volume 1 is a solid start to a great series, though it may feel incomplete due to the nature of serialized manga publishing, since the main story arc it starts doesn't actually conclude until the first chapter of the next volume. I've always thought that the series got better as it went on, so you have that to look forward to. Until then, I hope you all have a good day.